We have two really distinguished business professionals with us today, and we're glad that you're with us as well. Our focus now is on services. And one of the services that hasn't come up in any of the presentations is my industry, education. And in fact, Hong Kong is a terrific education center. And its universities are turning out world-beating talent in many different areas. Many of the folks being trained now in Hong Kong come from the mainland or from elsewhere in Asia. And it's important to recognize that. Of course, we're pretty good at that too here in the United States. We have more than 200,000 students from the mainland studying in the United States right now. And here in Southern California, we have about 10,000 of those students. At my university alone, we have 2,500 students from the mainland, about 200 students from Hong Kong, and about 500 students from Taiwan. And these students, of course, are already contributing to the local economy by their presence here. But we know, too, that after they graduate, they're going to go off and do wonderful things, create new companies, develop new products that we cannot even imagine today. And so let's keep our education in mind as we talk about services. Now, you heard earlier from the Commerce Secretary that 95% of Hong Kong's GDP is generated by services. So that makes it clear why this particular panel is on the program. This is really important, of course, for the Hong Kong economy. But Hong Kong could only serve so many businesses because the need is so great. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about today. For example, we all know about the transformation on the mainland, the move from low-wage assembly work, and now, of course, the giant market. Ronnie Chan just drove that home when he was talking about Jinan and a mall there that he's developed that had 20 million customers in its inaugural year. Of course, he mentioned South Coast Plaza, and any of us who have been there know that there's an effort there to cater to tourists from Hong Kong, from China, and from elsewhere in Asia. You can use your China Merchants Bank card there. You can do all kinds of business using some flavor of Chinese. So definitely services matter. But we also need to recognize that Asia, and especially Hong Kong and mainland China, are now places of innovation. And so some international companies, even giant ones, look to Asia not just as a great market, as a source of production, but as a source of innovation. So, for example, if you're in Mexico or if you're in Chile and you reach in a supermarket for the most popular orange drink, the most popular version of orange juice, it's pulpy. A product that Coca-Cola, through its Minute Maid brand, developed on the Chinese mainland. So these are innovation centers, not simply consumption centers or production centers. And this is really quite exciting. Now, a survey of CEOs, both here in the United States and around the Asia Pacific, they identified three big problems. More than 80% of the CEOs surveyed identified three big problems in moving into and taking advantage of markets and manufacturing and all sorts of things in Asia. You can probably guess those three problems that were at the top of the list. The first, of course, was the great variety of regulations. Inconsistency even within an economy in how those work. So, for example, the minimum capital requirements to set up a business are different in Qingdao, where it's 80,000, and in Shanghai, where it's 150,000. So that's a challenge, the regulatory variation and inconsistent application. The second big challenge mentioned by these CEOs was the problem of corruption. And of course, we're all familiar with the kinds of difficulties that businesses have in getting things done and wanting to do things the right way. And then the third problem, talent. How do you find, cultivate, and retain talent? These big challenges. Well, what do they have in common? Hong Kong. Hong Kong can help guide you. Hong Kong possesses the kinds of firms, the kinds of experts that know how to get things done when you're confronting that inconsistent regulatory situation. Can guide you into avoiding problems associated with corruption. Can guide you in terms of taking care of your human resources questions. Hong Kong, the perfect place for you to go as your gateway, not just to the mainland, but to all of Asia. What kinds of services are we talking about? Of course, the sort of market research that's required, the due diligence if you're going to form partnerships. Are these partners worthy of your partnership? Will they deliver what they promise? Today, we heard Ms. Yang mention that Hong Kong is the more mature woman who delivers what is promised. I would suggest also the woman that knows what to do, the woman who's conscious of your needs maybe before you are even aware of them yourself. Folks in Hong Kong know how to set up a business. They know how to deal with those kinds of challenges. They know about human resources issues. They also, of course, we've heard today, know a great deal about finance. And so there's a lot of expertise, a lot of experience. Long before any American multinational, long before General Motors, General Electric, or any of those companies went into the China market, Hong Kong business people were there, pioneering pathways. You can leverage that talent, you can leverage that experience, that expertise, by forming alliances with these folks. And what if things go wrong? We heard today about intellectual property issues and things like that. What if things go wrong? Well, if you think about it in advance, you can solve those problems through arbitration in Hong Kong, where more than 140 jurisdictions, including China and the United States, recognize the decisions made there. More than $8 billion was disputed in arbitration discussions in 2011. 500 cases resolved in Hong Kong. Now, friends, we have with us two outstanding individuals who have led very complicated companies to great success. You've heard already references made to Fung, to the Fung group. And we have with us today William Fung. If you consume anything, you should thank this company, because they have probably played some role in its creation, its design, its manufacture, although we heard before they don't manufacture as much. But certainly in terms of solving the logistics problems, the distribution problems for all kinds of companies. We have with us Dr. William Fung, who will speak to us about the kinds of services that his company provides, the kinds of challenges, those kinds of things. We also have with us Dr. Levin Zhu. Now, Dr. Zhu heads the China International Capital Corporation, a giant firm, right? Everybody listens when Dr. Zhu speaks. And for good reason. We heard today about the IPO triumphs in Hong Kong. If you look in your program, you'll see a list of some of the companies that Dr. Zhu played a role in taking public. I didn't have time for a detailed assessment, so I just went through the first half dozen of those names. Today, the market capitalization of those half dozen companies is about $1.5 trillion. Services rendered. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. William Fung and Dr. Levin Zhu.
Clay, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. But I think maybe a better introduction would be that I'm very proud to have been a former colleague of Daniel Fung's, who was prominently mentioned all morning. This is, I don't know if I was thinking about what to say, and I don't know, because everybody's talked about the services and so on, I actually like to have a slightly different angle on it. And because I was reminded of that joke, I feel like Elizabeth Taylor's seventh husband. I think I know what to do, but I don't know how to make it interesting. But having said that, what I'd like to do perhaps is to perhaps discuss with you the changing environment that Hong Kong operates in and why all the traditional strengths of Hong Kong for the last 30 years is not only valid but more in demand than ever. And perhaps the way I would like to couch my discussion would be in sort of three levels. First of all, the level of Hong Kong in the context of Asia. And then secondly, Hong Kong in the context of China. Obviously very important, and many of you here want to hear about that. But finally, Hong Kong on its own, and maybe part of just a smaller regional area in China called the Pearl River Delta. And perhaps I think that would put it in perspective and perhaps answer some of the questions that our chairman Jack So poses, that why not go to China directly and why not go to Asia directly. Let me first try to quickly put Hong Kong in the perspective of Asia. Hong Kong's strengths, and you've heard all morning from all the speakers about it, I will not repeat because you all know Hong Kong's strengths. But it is true that we had 170 years of the type of Western-style capitalism that everybody knows about and is familiar with and knows how to deal with. And that 170 years of capitalism, along with it, all the arrangements of the legal system and so on, and the fact that the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, the fact that we have a very efficient and I would say user-friendly tax regime, all that is taken for granted. The geographical center is also taken for granted. You heard from many speakers, Hong Kong is really smack in the middle of Asia. And that's really the major, I think, concern of everybody working in this century is the shift in the center of gravity of economic activity from Europe and America more towards Asia. Okay, not completely to Asia by any means, more towards Asia. And the importance of Asia means that any geographical position in Asia, you've got to look at travel distances and all the other things that other speakers have talked about. But as I look at Asia, Hong Kong's position in Asia, okay, I also, because of my consumer goods background, I would also be looking at it from a marketing point of view. Because Hong Kong has actually many markets. There are the very sophisticated investors, operators, who may say that, look, I can go, I need not just Hong Kong, I need to be in Shanghai, I need to be in Japan, I need to be everywhere. So that's one kind of sophisticated user of Hong Kong, okay, that Hong Kong maybe serves a part of their needs. Another kind would be less sophisticated, and they say that, look, I really need a center for China. And of course, our proximity to China, obviously has that advantage. But finally, there are those who are just getting started in Asia who say that I need one stop for everything for Asia. And then I think undoubtedly, everyone will agree that Hong Kong serves that purpose. But perhaps the most interesting market within Asia, and there are other markets coming up like India, but by far the most interesting market in Asia would be China. And what is happening to China that makes Hong Kong so relevant and more relevant going forward? Well, I think to understand the evolution of China, we always have a concept in my company of how China is evolving and why Hong Kong's relevant. And perhaps I can put it in that context. For some strange reason, it seems like China develops in cycles of 30 years, quite uncannily. If you think about it, the founding of the People's Republic, talking about modern China now, the founding of the People's Republic in China was 1949. The opening up of China was 1979, exactly 30 years. Okay, and in those 30 years, we could say the world lost China. China closed off from the rest of the world, became isolated. And Hong Kong was its window, was only window. And in those 30 years, though Hong Kong lost its raison d'etre, Hong Kong was set up ever since it went to the British as a colony in 1842, okay, as an entrepot to China. But when China closed off, okay, the world lost China and Hong Kong lost its raison d'etre to be China's entrepot. But what Hong Kong did was that we industrialized. I think that story is familiar to many of you, and we became an exporter in our own right, and we started, we think, the global trend, the global rationalization of labor-intensive types of manufacturing. And those skills still stand us in good stead today. The basis of my company is the knowledge and expertise, on the service side that we gained from servicing a manufacturing economy at first in Hong Kong. But what happened in 1979, again, I won't repeat that story in detail because you all know the story. 1979 to 2009, the second 30 years of modern China's development, there was a momentous historical change. I don't think of a caliber that the world has not seen before. And when Deng Xiaoping opened up China in 1979, there were two promises that China had. The first one was to provide the labor and the production capacity to supply the world with a lot of these labor-intensive types of goods. The other promise, okay, this is what we jokingly called in those days the billion toothbrush syndrome. The idea was that China's population is so big that if you would sow just one toothbrush to every Chinese, you get rich. That never happened in those 30 years, 1979 to 2009. But what did happen was that China delivered on its first promise to be the world's factory. And Hong Kong changed. Margie talked about the process of reinvention. We lost our entrepot position in 1949. We reinvented ourselves as a manufacturing center. Okay, we became uncompetitive and too expensive in 1979. China and other countries took over, and we became the supply chain manager for that kind of products and the trading types of skills that we have. So from 1979 to 2009, China became the world's factory and Hong Kong became its supply chain manager. Now, what's happening now? In 2009, and we predict until 2039, China will now deliver on its second promise, and that is to be the world's largest consumer market. There's a lot of talk about China being there already. It's not. It's not. Let's be realistic. It's simple arithmetic. The US economy is about $16 trillion. China is about 8, half the size, even though it's the second largest economy, just beating Japan a little bit. Okay, but within the US GDP, 70% of your GDP is consumption. China is 35%, exactly half. So there's a long way to go to catch up, but I think China will. China will catch up. And why 2009 and why the next 30 years? Well, it's very clear that in 2009 and the beginning of 2010, especially in the 12th five-year plan that the Chinese government puts out every 5 years, it was very clear that China thought that its role, the export trading role, the export manufacturing role that it had was unsustainable. We were creating unsustainable trade imbalances with a lot of our partner countries that we're selling to, including the United States. There's always talk, there has been every year talk here about currency manipulation and so on. And in any case, China was starting to they've reaped a demographic dividend in terms of their people. And now with the one-child policy in China, the demographics are showing that the prime working age, the factory age between 20 and 29 in China is actually starting to decline. And also China was building up unsustainable imbalances within the country. Because in order to export, you will remember the early years of China's opening up, they set up the special economic zones, the SEZs, along the coast, primarily because China did not have the infrastructure and it needed to get its goods to market. So the factories have been based near the ports. But that imbalance grew and grew. They were so successful in being the world's factory that it ran out of labor in the coastal area, and it started to import vast amounts of labor from the interior provinces. And this sloshing back and forth of migrant workers is creating social strains and tensions. Every Chinese New Year, as many of you will know, the flow of immigrant workers from the coastal area back to their villages would paralyze the whole infrastructure and the transportation system in China. So, and then the wealth gap between the coastal area and the interior. All these are giving them very good reasons why they should also rethink their model. So in the year, starting from 2010 onwards, okay, China's new goal is to develop the consumer market. And that is really that is the big opportunity for the world. Prior to that, I would say that American companies, including those in Los Angeles, would look at China as a place to do production, source their product, at a good price and bring it into the United States for consumption. But now I think China in the next 30 years is going to build up the domestic market, and it'll be a great market for America and companies in Los Angeles to export to. And in all this, Hong Kong will now play a different role. Hong Kong now will flip around its supply chain management capabilities, managing the export side of China's business, to now flipping it to the import side and becoming the showcase for a lot of American brands and other brands who want to enter China. Hong Kong, when China becomes the world's largest consumer market, which we probably will in 30 years' time, just because of sheer size, per capita there's still a big difference, of course, because of China's large population. But if you think about that, Hong Kong's role then, in terms of being China's service center, flips to being servicing companies from outside China selling into China. And that is really the big change in the orientation of a lot of the services that Hong Kong can offer. And companies that used to take product from China and have factory relationships and so on in China and other places in Asia is now turning around this machine and now supplying China. And then by extension, the rest of Asia. India at some point is coming up behind, another 1.2 billion people coming up. China is 1.3 billion people. The rest of Asia, Japan, if it revives under Abenomics, would be an interesting market again. And it's a very big market, it's the third largest market. And so would the rest of Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. And Hong Kong then becoming the showcase for China, becoming the flagship store for China. That role now will become very important, using the same skills, the same financial infrastructure that we built up, the same legal infrastructure advantages that we have, to service now China. Now, and I'm talking about now only my focus on American companies. Think about all the Chinese companies that want to come out. Hong Kong, again, is the conduit. And the term that the Hong Kong TDC uses, which is that Hong Kong is the super connector, to the vast Chinese market and by extension then the vast Asian market. Now, let me just turn quickly now to Hong Kong on its own. One of the misconceptions I'd like to correct is that because of the one country, two systems, and because there's a boundary between Hong Kong and China, that's the new term for border, people tend to ignore the fact that Hong Kong actually is an integral part of China in terms of markets. If you look at you look at the way that the consumer goods industries that I'm involved in look at markets around the world, we don't talk in terms of countries. We talk in terms of city clusters. When we look at markets, we talk about the LA city cluster. We talk about the New York City cluster. Same thing in China. If you look at China, there are about 10 major clusters, but the three most important is the Beijing, Tianjin, Bohai area. That's one cluster, big cluster. The second one is the Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta. That's the second market cluster. The third is actually the Pearl River Delta cluster, which is Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and very importantly, Hong Kong. Because of this boundary idea, people always tend to, even the Chinese government themselves, sort of leave out Hong Kong in the statistics when they look at the Pearl River Delta. But Hong Kong, of course, is very much a part of the Pearl River Delta. In fact, it's the largest economy in the Pearl River Delta and the most sophisticated. So if you add Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen together, that is in fact the most important city cluster in China. And that's why you don't look at, saying that, well, I'm going to go to China direct. Hong Kong is very much of China and maybe accounting for about a third in terms of its exports. in terms of the way it manages its hinterland and the supply chains that reach into that southern part of China. And then very importantly, its market. As you now go into an age where China is still going to be the factory of the world in a different way. I could talk about that later. In fact, that may even pose more of a threat to some of the advanced countries in the world in terms of manufacturing than it did before when it was involved in low value added types of assembly work. They're now upgrading actually what they're doing in terms of manufacturing. But the theme that I was saying that the big thing for change for Hong Kong is that China will become one of the world's largest consumer markets. And by itself, within the Pearl River Delta, it is a very large market. So I think with these comments, I'd like to pass it to Levin, who's going to talk about the financial dimension of Hong Kong, which actually is even as important.
Think Asia. Why? Asia has a population of close to 4 billion, which is over half of the world's 7 billion population. And now it counts about 1/3 of the global GDP. And also about a quarter of global trade. So that's, and also think about it, it is emerging, it is developing in the last several decades. Of course, China is one of them. It's one of the major active growing area, but also there's other Asian countries growing there. If you call, interestingly enough, most Asian countries are still in this sort of early development stage, maybe compared to Western Europe, compared to US. It is like a new frontier. If California was about the frontier 100 years ago, and interestingly enough, even now the Asian countries' average GDP per capita is about $5,000, which is just about the same amount in comparable way that U.S. had about 100 years ago. So I think there's great potential why we should focus on the Asia. If 100 years ago the frontier is to go west, now the frontier is to go east. And if you're thinking about Asia, then comes to the second part, I think Hong Kong. Why Hong Kong? Hong Kong, in the, one of the things I think is the sort of a history. Hong Kong in the last 150, 170 years developed into a city, which is, I think, very unique. For one thing, I noticed Hong Kong is very active in change itself, adapt to the environment. It used to serve as the China in the early time. It was a gateway or a window to the world for the ancient China. Now it's a natural gateway of Chinese economic development. And of course now it's at the crossroad of Asian development. So when anybody think about the longer term, think about what will be this century's opportunity for Asian development. If you want to have a development plan, a strategy, that I think, Hong Kong obviously got its unique place. It's really at the center of this development. Within 5 hours flight circle, you probably can reach most of the important Asian destinations. And in Hong Kong, there's a extensive establishment in terms of professionals like accountants, like lawyers, bankers, and businessmen and people in doing trading. I believe there is still a great development of trading, maybe even as people think, after this world crisis, financial crisis, financial industry is evolving, but people forget the real business, the real social development is still happening in the emerging Asia. There is still great potential in terms of trade development, in trade financing, in finance, and in further in the investment in these developing countries. So I think that's why I think Hong Kong is a natural first choice when people think about their Asian strategies. Even for a lot of mainland Chinese companies, we're one of them. We also choose Hong Kong as a natural platform, a staging place, when we wanted to expand our relationships with the rest of the world. It is a place where you can meet a lot of the important people. It's a place where you can quickly establish your business space. It's a very useful jumping board for you to connect with the rest of the world. That's sort of a perspective that we felt very, very useful. This is we actually done a lot of the listings, our execution when we go to the New York, and also sometimes California. We go first to Hong Kong, and then running around the globe, end up in Los Angeles. Thank you.
You may realize that, for example, Dr. Fung was originally trained as an engineer before he moved into focusing on business and transactions. But you may not also know that Dr. Zhu was trained as an atmospheric scientist. And so he was able to monitor how the weather was going to change, how the climate was going to change, and then moved into something even more complicated, how economies might change, right? How markets might change. Now, one of the exciting things that we can commemorate this year, this is a snake year. 2013 is a snake year. And the last snake year, 2001, was a very important year, of course, for the entire world, but especially for China. That's when China entered the WTO. And, of course, China's exports worldwide have increased, and especially exports to the United States since 2001. What most Americans are not conscious of is that American exports to China have increased at a faster rate than Chinese exports to the United States. Over the last 12 years, since the last snake year, American exports to China have increased fivefold, whereas Chinese exports to the United States have increased fourfold. Now, William was talking about that prospect and how he's now helping companies get into China and do business in China. And I was wondering if, because we have a lot of folks in the room who have some experience, but many more who are just thinking about getting into Asia and maybe particularly China. You folks have a lot of experience. What kinds of mistakes are common, and how can we avoid them?
Okay, well, I can only perhaps share with you our own experience, and although we're from Hong Kong and we live right at the footsteps of China for 170 years before becoming part of China, frankly, the Chinese market is evolving. And one of the things about China is that the institutions are changing. It came from a fairly strict non-market economy where everything was owned by the government, state-owned, to now where private enterprise is probably the most vibrant part of the economy. And as a result, there's a huge change. I could just tell you a few of the major changes that I've seen just in my 30 years of working in China. By the way, I should really say this. One of the things I always share with my American friends is that, they can't understand. They keep asking me, William, there are two things they keep telling me. The first one is that China is really big, complex, old civilization and big market. How do you get to understand China? And my usual response is that, China is probably the easiest country in the world we work in because they have a 5-year plan. Every time I talk to a Chinese official somewhere, he always reaches back, and pulls out his 5-year plan and says, okay, Mr. Fung, we're here now, and we're going to do this next year. I mean, it's probably the 5-year plan is probably the most underutilized piece of information that you have. It's a one-day wonder in the Western press when they promulgate it, and then people just forget about it. I mean, for example, all this fuss about Chinese growth now dropping, to 7-8%. Well, they was in the plan. All you have to do is read the plan, and they will tell you that growth is going to be 7-8% because they want more inclusive growth, right? Slower growth, Levin. The second big thing about China is that, well, how could a communist country like that, be so vibrant and grow so quickly? Well, my usual response is that in 30 years of working in China, I've never met a communist. So these are the two things you keep in mind. But what is true is that because of the way that the economy was organized before, you're now switching from an economy where controlling supply was key. I mean, Levin would tell you more better than anybody. In the old days, it was the companies or the state-owned companies who controlled supply because supply was shortage. And the market basically lined up. I mean, you probably remember pictures in Russia, for example, which follow the same model, people queuing up. And there was obviously, China also went through its stage where it had food coupon and clothing coupons and so on. But boy, has that changed now. It's now a demand-driven economy, very, very similar to the West. And I think in that respect, it's a big market and it's complex. And maybe the fourth point, and I'm sure Levin has a lot to talk about, in terms of tackling the Chinese market, understand that China is a very big, geographically it's very big, and the weather-wise it's very big, north, south, east, west. One of the things that people don't realize is that if you go from the coast of Fujian to Kashgar, which is the westernmost point of China, is the same width as the United States, coast to coast. And so it has a great diversity of climates, then therefore markets, there's a great diversity. We have different dialect groups. And so really China is many markets. It's really hard for me to envision somebody say, well, I'm going to tackle the China market. I always would ask them, which part of the China market are you talking about? Because coming back to my earlier statement, I think you've got to really look at China as different markets. The most important three, which I enumerated, would be like that. And then the fourth point, the last point about China is that it's changing. It's changing very quickly. What you consider to be a backwater city 10 years ago could now be a thriving major metropolis. With all the needs of a modern urban economy. And what you consider to be downtown center, for example, in Guangzhou, is no longer, because with urban redevelopment and so on, they've now completely built different city centers. And when they put in the subway system and so on, they recreate really the geography that's so different. And the main thing to remember about China is that the speed with which all these changes take place. Take all your experience with the Western markets and now double that speed. And that's the Chinese speed. And the reason they could do that is probably because of the mode of government is still fairly autocratic, and therefore they could turn on a dime. Whereas I think under most other democratic governmental systems, it takes a long time for policy to change and so on. So always keep that in mind. China is not China. I mean, I always have to remind myself that I maybe consider myself an old China hand to the extent that I went in as soon as China opened, and we did a lot there. But I've got to wipe out everything I remember about how China operated in the 70s and 80s, because now it's totally different again. So I think these are the only things that I could say, Clay, about working in China, but I'm sure Levin has a lot to say.
Well, you obviously have much more experience than I have. But I also heard a lot of people talking about this. I believe China has great potential in terms of business and economic development. But on the other hand, it may not be that easy. It may take a lot of time. And the most important thing is you know enough the basics about the situation, and you better it's usually good advice to find a good, dependable partner. They usually have the understanding and the synergy, I think if you are on your own, fine. Find some good, trustable advisors to let you know enough about the situation.
Thank you. So you heard, read the plan, look at the map, do your due diligence, discover these markets and see how you fit in, get good partners that you can trust.
From Hong Kong.
From Hong Kong, that's right.
I don't know, Jack was looking at us. We didn't mention Hong Kong. Find a partner in Hong Kong.
Want to make sure that you understand whose name is on the board here. We have about 20 questions, and we have about a minute. So it's going to be quite impossible for us to go through. And the range of these questions run from some new residents of Hong Kong all the way through IP questions and other kinds of things. But one of the questions that has come up in a couple of different ways involves the opportunity for ordinary Americans to gain access to the opportunities that are present in Hong Kong and in China with regard to investing, getting greater access to the stock markets, and being able to buy into mutual funds and things like this, investment vehicles created in Hong Kong but focused on China. And I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that.
Yes, I think there's obviously the so-called China-related stock like red chips. Those are the companies with major operation in mainland, but then they I think they registered and listed in Hong Kong. There's also A-share companies which are mostly mainland companies listed in Hong Kong, and there's plenty of opportunity of other now developing exchange traded fund type that have you to have the exposure to Chinese equities investment.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've all learned a great deal, and we're anxious now to move into a networking lunch, a great opportunity to meet all the folks in the room and to seize that opportunity. I just want, on behalf of the panel, to thank the Hong Kong Trade Development Council for affording us this opportunity to interact with you, and I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you all.